At the edge of a forgotten village, on a cold morning that smelled of wet earth and smoke, a 30-year-old man stood in the middle of an empty yard and realized his life was over. Not ruined, not damaged, over. The oxen were gone. The grain store had been emptied before sunrise. The wooden cart he once used to carry sacks to the market was no longer by the fence. Even the front door of his house hung open like a mouth that had already told the whole village the news. And the village had heard. By the time the sun rose above the fields, people were already watching from a distance. Not helping, just watching. Some stood with folded arms. Some whispered behind their sleeves. Some looked at him the way people look at a burned house after the fire is gone. Quietly, safely, as if disaster might still be contagious. A year earlier, they had spoken his name with admiration. Now they spoke it with pity. And pity, in a small village, can feel crueler than hatred. His name was Elias Rowan. At 30, Elias had lost everything a man could lose without being buried. His land was no longer his. His animals had been taken to settle debts. His tools had been claimed. His good name, the one he had spent years building with sweat and pride, had cracked in a single season. Men who once shook his hand in public now passed him like a stranger. Women lowered their voices when he walked by. Children had already started repeating what they heard at dinner tables, that he had reached too high, that he had forgotten his place, that this was what happens when a man wants more than life meant to give him. And maybe the cruelest part of all, some of them were glad, because people can forgive struggle, they can forgive small dreams. But when someone from among them dares to rise, and then falls, they do not just watch the fall, they study it, they feed on it. Elias said nothing. He just stood there, staring at the hollow remains of the life he had built with his own hands. The wind moved through the yard. A loose rope tapped softly against a post. Somewhere behind him, a shutter knocked once. Then again, it sounded like a slow, deliberate warning. What no one in that village knew that morning was this. The worst thing Elias lost was not his money. It was not his land. It was not even the future he had imagined for himself. What he lost was far more dangerous. He lost the story he had been telling himself about who he was. And when a man loses that, when the version of himself he trusted most suddenly collapses, he does not just become poor, he becomes lost. But here is the part no one saw coming. That empty yard, that public shame, that morning when the whole village thought his life had ended, was not the end of Elias Rowan. It was the beginning of the one life that would finally be real. And the truth of how he lost everything, and what he found in the ashes, is far stranger, far more painful, and far more powerful than anyone in that village could have imagined. To understand how a man can lose his whole life in a single season, you have to see who Elias Rowan was before the silence took him. Elias had not been born into greatness. He came from plain people, hard people, the kind who measured a man not by what he said, but by what his hands could build before sunset. His father worked a narrow strip of land at the edge of the village. His mother spun wool, kept the fire alive, and stretched every coin until it begged for mercy. They were not miserable. They were simply ordinary. And Elias, from the time he was a boy, could not bear the thought of being ordinary. Not because he hated the village, not because he thought he was above anyone, but because somewhere deep inside him lived a quiet, restless hunger, the kind that does not let a man sleep easy under a low roof. He would watch the traders pass through the village square with loaded wagons and polished boots, and something in him would tighten. He wanted more than survival, more than enough bread for winter, more than the small, safe life every man around him seemed willing to accept. He wanted to become someone people remembered, and for a while, it looked like he would. Elias was not loud. He was not charming. He did not drink with fools or brag in public. That made him even more impressive. He worked longer than other men, learned faster, took fewer breaks. While others were content with one field, Elias leased a second, then a third. He bought stronger tools, hired 2 laborers, began trading timber and grain beyond the next valley. Slowly, then suddenly, his name started carrying weight. Old men nodded when he passed. Shopkeepers trusted him with credit. Fathers pointed him out to their sons as an example of discipline. Even those who envied him had to admit it. Elias Rowan was becoming the kind of man people listened to. And that was the beginning of the danger. Because success, if it comes too early, can make a person believe he is wiser than he really is. Elias started to confuse momentum with judgment. He began taking bigger risks, not wild ones, not foolish ones on the surface, but the kind that look reasonable when everything has been going your way. A larger grain shipment before harvest, a borrowed sum against expected profits, a partnership with a merchant from another region who smiled too quickly and promised too much. Elias told himself this was how men rose. This was how lives changed. Maybe part of him even liked the way the village looked at him now. That mattered more than he admitted. Then the weather turned. Heavy rains came too early. Roads softened into mud. One wagon overturned near the river crossing. Part of the grain spoiled before it ever reached market. Then came word that the merchant who owed Elias payment had vanished from an inn 2 towns away. Along with the money, the ledgers, and every promise he had made. That should have been the blow he recovered from. But life rarely stops after one hit. Because Elias had built too wide, too fast, and too proudly, the debt he had taken on began breathing down his neck. Buyers delayed. Workers wanted wages. Lenders stopped sounding polite. The more he tried to hold everything together, the more everything slipped through his hands. He sold tools to cover one payment, then livestock to cover another. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, stopped listening when the few people who still cared warned him to pull back and save what remained. He could not do it. A man obsessed with proving his worth will often destroy himself before he admits he is in danger. And by the time Elias understood that, the trap had already closed. And once a trap closes around a proud man, the world does not rush in to save him. It steps back and watches. The weeks that followed did not feel dramatic. They felt slow, humiliating, endless. That was the worst part. Elias had once moved through the village with purpose. Now he moved carefully, as if even his footsteps were apologizing. He took whatever work he could find, mending broken fences, hauling water, cutting wood for men who used to ask his advice and now tossed him a few coins without meeting his eyes. Sometimes they were kind about it, which hurt even more. Pity has a way of making a man feel smaller than cruelty ever could. He stopped going through the market at busy hours. He waited until late afternoon, when most people had gone home and only the tired sellers remained. He learned how to keep his head down, how to answer short, how to live inside silence. But silence is dangerous, because when a man stops speaking to the world, he starts listening too closely to the worst voice inside himself. At night, Elias lay awake on a straw mattress in the back room of his old family house, staring into darkness, replaying the same story again and again. He had been betrayed. He had been cheated. He had been ruined by weather, by luck, by dishonest men, and maybe some of that was true. But deep down, beneath the anger, there was another feeling. Something heavier. Shame. Not shame that he had lost money. Shame that he had failed in public. Shame that the village had seen him rise, and then watched him fall. And that shame clung to him harder than debt ever had. Then, near the end of winter, something happened that no one expected. The merchant Elias had blamed for everything. The man from another region, the one who had disappeared with the payment and the ledgers, was found dead on the road beyond the Pine Hills. Not murdered, not robbed, frozen beneath an overturned cart after a storm no one knew he had ridden into. The news spread through the village in a single afternoon. Some said justice had found him. Some said God had. Elias said nothing. But 3 days later, an old constable rode to the village and placed a weather-worn leather satchel in Elias's hands. This was tied beneath the cart, the constable said. It has your name on a paper inside. Elias took the satchel like it might burn him. That night, by lamplight, he opened it. Inside were soaked account pages, a broken seal, and a small folded letter wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, but clear enough. It was from the merchant. And what Elias read that night cracked open the story he had been telling himself. The man had not run off with Elias's money. He had been trying to reach the village before the storm, carrying proof that another lender, a local one, had altered the terms of their agreement after Elias signed it, quietly, legally enough to trap him, cruelly enough to finish him. The missing payment had been seized before it ever reached the merchant's hands. The ledgers in the satchel showed it. So did the seal. But the deepest cut was not in the fraud. It was in the final lines of the letter. You would not listen when I warned you to slow down. You only listened to praise. You wanted to grow faster than your roots could hold. I was coming back because I knew what they were doing to you, and because I knew you would never see it in time. Elias read those lines once, then again. Then he set the paper down and covered his mouth with both hands. Because in that moment, the truth arrived all at once. Yes, he had been trapped. Yes, someone had helped push him into ruin. But the door had been standing open long before they closed it on him. He had mistaken attention for respect, speed for strength, expansion for wisdom, and worst of all, he had built his whole life around being seen as a man of importance, instead of becoming one in private first. That night, Elias did not rage. He did not swear revenge. He did not curse the dead merchant, or the lender, or the village. He sat in the weak amber light until the oil burned low. And for the first time since losing everything, he asked a different question. Not, how do I get it all back? But, who was I becoming before all this fell apart? And that question, quiet as it was, would change the rest of his life. Once a man begins asking the right question, he can no longer go back to living the old lie. When spring returned to the village, Elias did not try to reclaim the life he had lost. That was the first sign he had truly changed. He did not run from door to door asking for credit. He did not chase big deals. He did not stand in the square telling people he would rise again. The old Elias would have done that. The old Elias would have needed everyone to know he was not finished. This time, he said nothing. He walked to the far end of the village, to a collapsed shed that had once belonged to his grandfather, and he began cleaning it out with his own hands. Rotting boards, broken handles, rusted hinges, things everyone else had already decided were useless. Day after day, he carried them into the light, sorted them, repaired what he could, and burned what could not be saved. People noticed, of course they did. A village notices everything. Some laughed and said ruin had made him small. Others said he had finally learned his place. A few even sounded relieved, as if a humbled Elias Rowan made the world feel balanced again. But Elias kept working, not fast, not loudly, just steadily, among the things left behind in that shed where his grandfather sold tools. A carving knife, a hand plane, a worn mallet, a set of iron chisels wrapped in cloth. As a boy, Elias had watched those tools shape tables, wagon wheels, handles, gates. Useful things, honest things, things made not to impress anyone, but to serve. So he began there. At first, he repaired stools, yokes, cracked doors, broken plow handles. Small jobs, low pay to glory. But he did them carefully, and people began to notice another strange thing. When Elias worked now, he no longer worked like a man trying to prove something. He worked like a man trying to get something right. That changes the hands. That changes the eyes. That changes everything. One farmer came because a wheel had split. Then another because a grain chest would not close. Then a widow asked him to fix the frame of her late husband's bed. Elias took each job seriously, whether it paid much or almost nothing. He listened more, promised less, finished what he started, and slowly, trust returned. Not the noisy kind he once chased, the real kind. The kind that travels quietly from one house to another. By the second harvest, Elias' little shed had become a place people depended on. He built stronger carts, cleaner storage chests, better tool racks, water troughs that lasted through winter. Farmers from nearby paths started stopping by. Men who once spoke of him with smirks now asked for his opinion. Boys came just to watch him work. Then came the test. A wealthy landholder from beyond the valley heard that Elias had skill, discipline, and a name people still remembered. He offered him a chance to manage a much larger timber operation, bigger than anything Elias had handled before. More money in one season than Elias now made in 3 years. More status, more reach, more of the old dream, dressed in fresh clothes. For one long night, Elias could feel the old hunger rising again. The itch to be seen, the pull of becoming important, the dangerous sweetness of being admired. He stood outside his shed after dark, one hand resting on the rough wood of the door, and understood that this was the moment that would decide whether he had rebuilt a life, or merely rebuilt the road back to ruin. And this time, he did something the old Elias never would have done. He walked away from the offer. And in turning down that offer, Elias did not lose an opportunity. He saved the life he had nearly destroyed once before. The years that followed were not grand in the way the village once imagined greatness. They were better. His shed grew into a proper workshop. Then another room was added. Then a covered space for drying timber in the rain. He trained 2 young men who had more impatience than skill, and slowly taught them what life had taught him the hard way. That strength without steadiness is dangerous, and ambition without truth will eventually eat the man carrying it. Elias never became the richest man in the region, but something far rarer happened. He became trusted. When a cart broke before harvest, people came to him. When a family needed a table for a wedding, they came to him. When a widow could not afford a repair, he found a way anyway. His hands built doors, chests, cradles, fences, mill handles, pieces of ordinary life. And piece by piece, without chasing it, he built a name stronger than the one he had lost. Not louder, stronger. There is a difference. Years later, some of the same men who had once watched him fall came asking for advice before making risky deals of their own. They expected formulas, tricks, some secret for how to recover after ruin. Elias would usually smile, then shake his head, because the truth was simpler and harder. A man does not rebuild his life by getting back what he lost. He rebuilds it by becoming someone who no longer needs to build on illusion. That was the lesson. What broke Elias was not only debt, bad weather, or betrayal. It was the hunger to be seen as important before he had become solid inside. And what saved him was not revenge, luck, or one grand chance. It was the quiet decision to stop worshiping the version of himself that had led him into ruin. Sometimes losing everything is not life punishing you. Sometimes it is life refusing to let you keep living a false story. So if you are in a season where something has fallen apart, a dream, a plan, a version of yourself you were sure would last, do not ask only, how do I get back what I lost? Ask this instead. Who do I need to become so I never build my life on that lie again? If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a perspective or a lesson you needed so you can finally do something with your life, please like this video and share it with someone who needs it. And tell me in the comments, what is one loss that ended up teaching you something important? I'll be back with another story to help you keep growing. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.